What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to High Volume Video. I'm Keith, and we're about a week into the month of October, which means spooky season's here. I'm trying to watch nothing but horror movies this month, and I'm really trying to get to at least one a night. Last year, one of the first videos I made on this channel was a recap of all the horror movies I watched in October last year, and that was a really fun video to make, but it took a lot of time. It ended up being like an hour long. This year I want to do something a little different. I want to try to chronicle these on a weekly basis, so I'm going to really try to make a video each week at the end of the week, just going over the 5 to 7 horror movies that I've watched. Hopefully I can get to one a day. That's my goal, but no promises. So this video is going to be week 1 of my 31 Days of Horror challenge. Let's get into it. Alright, so on October 1st, I started off the month with Drag Me to Hell from director Sam Raimi. This is from 2009, I believe, and it came right after he finished up his Spider-Man trilogy. No shade to those movies, but I love Drag Me to Hell. I think this is one of Sam Raimi's best movies, if not his best movie. And it really does feel like a spiritual successor to Evil Dead 2, and Army of Darkness, in my opinion. It definitely has that same kind of cartoonish, over-the-top gore and dark humor and violence that, the Evil Dead trilogy had. It really does feel like Sam Raimi, just after he got done with his Spider-Man trilogy, he wanted or needed to go back to his horror roots, and I love this movie. I love Drag Me to Hell. The story follows a bank loan officer named Christine, played by Alison Lohman. She gets cursed by an old gypsy woman after she refuses to give the woman an extension on her home loan. The old woman is super embarrassed and says she feels like she's been shamed during this interaction. And there's kind of this moral dilemma with Christine where she knows what's right and what's wrong, but she's trying to get this promotion at work, so she decides not to give this old gypsy woman an extension on her loan, which she really could have. But I definitely don't think that she deserves what ends up happening to her. She ends up being haunted by this demonic force laid upon her by this curse, and it turns into a pretty comedic but also scary at times countdown, as she has only 3 days to figure out how to break this curse before she's taken away by this demon to hell. So that's kind of like the gist of the story. Some of my favorite moments, there's this parking garage scene where Christine and the gypsy get in a fight in her car, and throughout the parking garage, it's an awesome fight scene. It's super ridiculous, super over the top, pretty gory. There's lots of stuff like that in the movie. So yeah, if you're into the goofy, over the top horror comedy, Sam Raimi, Evil Dead type stuff, and you haven't seen this, I definitely think you should check it out. That's Drag Me to Hell from 2009. Alright, so then on October 2nd, for the first time, actually, I watched Tom Savini's remake of Night of the Living Dead. Tom Savini is definitely more well known for his makeup effects work, but this is one of the few movies that he actually directed. And if you see at the top there, it actually says George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead still. I don't know too much about the history of this movie, but it is cool that Tom Savini, who regularly worked with George Romero, as far as I know, was the one to direct this. So this remake follows the story of George Romero's original Night of the Living Dead pretty closely, with a few exceptions. The end is a little different, and the barber character is a little different. All the characters are pretty similar, but there are minor changes here and there. The effects and the action and everything are definitely cranked up. You can tell this is a 90s movie and directed by a guy who was a master of special effects and makeup effects. Tony Todd is actually cast as Ben in this one, which I think is a perfect casting. He does a great job playing Ben in this movie. Patricia Tolman plays the barber character, who's a little different in this one. I feel like she's a little bit more of a badass in this one. She definitely does a little bit more fighting back and takes a little bit more of a leadership role in the group. Just like the original, the story follows a group of survivors who all end up on this farm during the beginning of the zombie apocalypse. Explores how different people from different backgrounds handle this survival situation. There's some bad eggs in the bunch, just like in the original. So I think the real heart of the original stays intact in this remake. Might not be as dramatic, I don't think. This one definitely relies a little bit more heavily on the action and the effects and the gore and all that. But I don't think the message of the original is completely lost. George Romero is known for, having a lot of social commentary in his movies. This one, Dawn of the Dead in particular, has a lot of commentary on society, I think. And this remake of Night of the Living Dead doesn't completely lose that, but it's not really the forefront. This is definitely more of a 90s take on Night of the Living Dead. Then on October 3rd, I watched 13 Ghosts from 2001 from director Steve Beck, who also did Ghost Ship. I have a lot of nostalgia for this movie, and I think a lot of people my age do as well. I don't think it's regarded critically as a great horror movie, but yeah, I think a lot of people my age are fans of this one. One of the highlights of this movie for me, obviously, is all the ghost designs. I think they're really cool. They all have kind of unique backstories, too. You don't get a ton of backstory on them, I would guess, but the backstory that you do get on them is pretty cool. And some of them are just really cool designs. The Jackal specifically, I think, looks awesome. He's the one with the cage on his head, I believe. Matthew Lillard from Scream and Shannon Elizabeth from American Pie are also in this, so that's a plus. Matthew Lillard's character plays this sort of psychic medium guy who's helping the villain of the movie, Cyrus, collect these ghosts in the beginning, and without completely spoiling the movie, basically Cyrus ends up dying, like I said, and he leaves his home to some relatives, Shannon Elizabeth being one of them. Family members go to the house. Things go awry from there. I don't want to totally spoil it. It's a fun ride, though. There's some really cool atmosphere in this movie, some savage deaths, some really cool practical effects. Like I said, the ghost designs are awesome. I think this movie is worth watching just to see that stuff. Definitely check it out if you haven't seen it. That's 13 Ghosts. Then on the 4th, I watched The Mist from 2009. This is based on a Stephen King story, and it's directed by Frank Darabont, who also did The Shawshank Redemption and the first couple seasons of The Walking Dead. And it's interesting because there's some correlation between this and the first couple seasons of The Walking Dead. A lot of the cast from the first season of The Walking Dead appear in this movie, actually. It explores some similar themes as well, but definitely on a much smaller scale, I would say. What I love about this movie is it's really at its core about what happens to humanity and civility and society when our man-made sort of guardrails and structures crumble. The small town grocery store setting is just kind of this microcosm of society. There are a lot of characters, and the most interesting thing about the film isn't even really the monsters to me, and the mystery of the mist and where it came from and what that is. That stuff is interesting, but I feel like the real meat of the story is the people and their response and how they all react to the situation that they find themselves in. I'd say one of the main villains of the movie is this hyper-religious woman who finds meaning in everything that's going on and has some sort of religious explanation for all of it, and it ends up being very similar to The Walking Dead in another way again, where it's one of those things where the monsters, yes, they're monsters, but it's people that are the real monsters and do even worse things than what these creatures are doing. Overall, I think The Mist is great. I love this movie. Been watching it pretty much yearly ever since it came out. I think it's that good. But if I had to be nitpicky and pick just one or two things that I think maybe haven't aged the best, it's probably the CGI of the creatures at times isn't the best. And sometimes the design of the creatures isn't the best either, in my opinion. The spider creatures look a little bit too similar to the big mosquito things, I think. I think they could have done a little bit better job with that stuff. And you can't talk about The Mist without talking about the insanely bleak ending that this movie has. It doesn't really bother me too much. I've never really been that bothered by the ending. But I also wouldn't fault anyone for not liking the movie because of the way it ends. It's probably the most bleak ending of any movie I've ever seen. But regardless of that, I love The Mist. I think it's great. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. Then on October 5th, I watched Zombie Flesh Eaters from 1979, directed by Lucio Fulci. I think this is the unofficial sequel to the Italian version of Dawn of the Dead. The history of this is kind of complicated. I'm not an expert on Italian horror. I just know this has many names. It goes by Zombie 2, Zombie Flesh Eaters. Basically, Zombie Flesh Eaters follows a journalist and the daughter of a famous scientist, I believe, who meet after a zombie is found on the woman's missing father's boat. In the beginning of the movie, this boat is found floating in a river in New York City with no passengers, just this zombie. The journalist and the woman named Anne travel to the island of Matol while they're investigating her missing father. And while they're there, when they arrive, they find that the dead are coming back to life and crawling out of their graves. On the way, though, one of the most insane and infamous scenes in horror history, you get to see a zombie fighting a shark. Once Anne and her friends get to the island, they meet Dr. David Menard. He's a scientist who's studying the undead and trying to figure out what's going on, what's causing the dead people in this village to come back to life. It's typical zombie fare stuff. Fulci's really good at it, though. The practical effects are awesome, super gross, super nasty. It's a little different than the George Romero, like more Western style zombie movies, I would say. But I think if you haven't seen it and you're looking for maybe a different take on the zombie type movie, I would say this is a really good place to start. Zombie Flesh Eaters, definitely check it out. Then on October 6th, I decided to watch another Fulci movie, and I went with City of the Living Dead. This is, I believe, the first in his Gates of Hell trilogy, and I think this is the first movie he did after Zombie Flesh Eaters. Once again, the dead are rising from their graves full of worms and bugs and typical Fulci goop. This one follows a psychic and a reporter on a mission to close the gates of hell after a priest hangs himself for unknown reasons, as far as I could tell, and opens up a passageway to hell. The City of the Living Dead is full of all the same goopy, nasty, Fulci zombie stuff, but I definitely like the setting and atmosphere of this one more. The island setting of Zombie 2 was not my favorite. A lot of it takes place in the day. This one is more my vibe for sure. A lot of it takes place on these like foggy streets at night, really cool lighting, and just a more creepy atmosphere vibe to it, which I am a fan of. Again, though, I will say if I had to make one complaint about City of the Living Dead and kind of just Italian horror in general, is a lot of the time the plot is hard to follow, especially on your first viewing. Once you know where the story is going, it's a little bit easier to just kind of sit back and enjoy the nasty, goopy effects and just kind of like the crazy, wild imagery and hyper violent stuff that's going on in these kinds of movies. I think City of the Living Dead is definitely worth checking out, especially if you're into Italian stuff. If you're into Italian stuff, you've probably already seen this, but I would say if you're looking to dip your toes in, I think Zombie 2 or Zombie Flesh Eaters and City of the Living Dead are both worth checking out. All right, and then on the 7th, I decided to go with sort of a guilty pleasure of mine, and that's George A. Romero's Diary of the Dead. One of his later entries. This is from the 2000s, 2007. I was just in the mood for more zombie stuff. Zombie movies in general are just kind of one of my favorite subgenres of horror. I'll admit this is not a great movie. It's one that I have some nostalgia for, though. I watched this one back in college, and I really dug kind of like the lower budget found footage approach that George Romero went with for this movie. The fact that it follows a group of college film students was also pretty appealing to me. When I was in school in 2007, when this movie came out, I was studying video production, and I wasn't in film school necessarily, but it was similar, and a lot of people that I went to school with, we all had ambitions of making short films or getting into the film industry. My degree was actually in video and motion graphics, but anyways, that's beside the point. The fact that the movie centered around film students interested me. I honestly think this movie was kind of ahead of its time too. When you really think about it, it's commenting a lot on how everything is filmed nowadays, and even so this came out in 2007, so it was like kind of before the boom of like social media and TikTok and everybody having iPhones and or phones with cameras on them at least, and sharing everything on social media. So typical George A. Romero fashion, he weaves in some social commentary in this. And yeah, I'll admit it's not a great movie. Probably wouldn't recommend it to everybody, but if you're a diehard Zombie fan or a diehard George Romero fan and you haven't checked this one out yet, just due to its reputation, I would say it's still worth checking out. So yeah, that's Diary of the Dead. All right, that's it for week 1 of my 31 Days of Horror Challenge. Here are all the movies I watched again. Be sure to let me know down in the comments if you've seen any of these, what you think of them. And also let me know down there what you're watching for 31 Days of Horror. Are you trying to do what I'm trying to do and watch one horror movie a night for the entire month of October? If you are, let me know what you're watching. Let me know your list. And yeah, thanks for watching the video. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing that. It helps out the channel. Leave a like, comment, all that jazz. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.